how we got started. So first, I would like to talk about you and how you got into writing. So how did you get into writing novels?
So in elementary school, there was this girl in my class, and she told the whole class that she was an author. And so I decided to get in on that and try and write my own books. I started making little books out of little folded pieces of paper, and then I would put them in the class library, and then the kids would go and pick them up and like, what's this? And then, so the whole class started getting in on that, and then the teacher made it like a full assignment for the class, and it was like a whole thing. For books, I started writing screenplays because I wanted to be a director. And I wrote my first book as a screenplay first, which is The Blood of Steel. And my dad said, oh, you should turn that into a book so that people can buy it and read it. And then I was like, oh, no, I'm not gonna do that, it's too much work. And then I did it, and here we are now, 4 books down.
That's pretty amazing. And now this book is different for you because you've changed. So you went from sci-fi to horror. Before we jump into this book, what inspired you to write sci-fi?
I've always loved sci-fi and fantasy. When I was really young, my parents, we would watch like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and stuff on the couch at night. And that was where I started to get into it. And then my parents are nerds as well, and they volunteered at the Comic Expo and things like that. So I've always been kind of surrounded by it.
And so what made you switch over into horror?
I think I wrote this book starting out as more of like kind of a science fiction more type of thing. But I've always kind of been adjacent to horror in some way. Like playing the video games of horror and horror movies and things like that. And then when I started writing this one, it kind of gradually turned into horror. And then I realized that it was way more fun writing horror than writing the other things.
Now you get really detailed into your characters, and you put a lot of thought into what goes behind them. When we were discussing the book, you talked about the creatures and the monsters that were created by the villain and how everything about them has something special. How long did it take you to come up with each character, and why did you put so much detail into them?
I think it's important for genre fiction specifically to be written well, because a lot of people look at science fiction or horror and they think, oh, it's just some campy thing. But I really wanted to kind of make these characters relatable. I wanted them to mean something. Every aspect of the book kind of means something in some way, even down to how I describe like a cigarette, as my dad points out. The monsters specifically, I love the idea of making the monsters in a horror book mean something to the characters. I think that, you know, if it's just a vampire chasing you or a zombie or something, it's okay, but it's more interesting if it's a psychological thing, that the monster is designed in a certain way to reflect the character. So like the main character in here is a war veteran. He has a lot of guilt weighing him down, and so the big monster in the book is kind of weighed down by this wooden rack as it chases him around, and just various little metaphorical things like that.
Now, do you want to tell us about your favorite character in this book without giving the whole story away?
Probably the main character, his name is Dewey Becker. Mostly because whenever I would write something before, I would always kind of like lean on this type of character, kind of like a tall, dark, person. But for this one, I wanted to do something different. So I was looking through images of characters on Pinterest and things. And I saw this image of basically this guy. And it was like, oh, that feels to my head more like a character that I can do something with. And then usually I give them some fancy name that's kind of lyrical and whatever. But for this one, I wanted to give them like a kind of normal name you wouldn't expect from like a fancy main character. So I called him Dewey Becker, which is not something I would usually choose, but I think that by doing those things, it forced me to write him more interestingly.
How long did it take you to write this book? And now you went through the process of the characters and designing them. When you started to think about the themes and all the scenes that they're in and what's going, how long did it take you to just come up with ideas before putting it into the actual story? Or do you just sit down and write?
Usually it's a combination of both. Typically, before I would do it differently and the wrong way in my opinion, but what I do now is I come up with a main character and I come up with characters that I know that I want at some point. And then I can say, okay, this kind of idea for this scene might happen, like an image in my head of like a freezer with like pigs hung up on hooks or something like that. So then I jot that down in my notes. And then I basically collect a big notepad of ideas and characters and things. And then I never plan the story out by beats. I only write, I start and say, okay, this main character's doing this now. And then I like to say that I let the characters tell me who they are and what they want to do and why they're doing it. Because it should just naturally say, if they're written well, if they're written, with enough complexity, then it should be obvious to the writer to say, okay, this person would do this, they wouldn't do this. And then I kind of follow that trail.
Who's inspired you and who are your favorite authors?
I'd say my favorite author is Stephen King, obviously. My dad would listen to his audiobooks in the car while we were driving places, and it was just kind of weird and nothing I've ever read or heard before. And then I started to look into him more and read into him, and I started to see what he was doing. I think Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, obviously is just the way that he kind of writes something and the whole backstory. He wrote the history before he wrote the book. So that kind of thing is important to me to build the world before I write the story, at least in the planning of it. I'd say George R.R. Martin from Game of Thrones, who wrote Game of Thrones. Before I wrote The Plight of Steel, I didn't know how to write a book. And when I was in my school library, I found a Game of Thrones. And I would read it and just kind of pick out what he was doing and see like, okay, the dialogue is this way and the punctuation and all the formatting and stuff. And then I built off of that from, learning and looking it up and stuff. But a lot of the formative stuff of how to write a book came from Game of Thrones.
Now, before you do your reading, what advice would you give to anybody who wants to be an author or write a story?
I would say just do it. And that's a very vague thing to say, but I didn't know how to write a book before I wrote one. I think that your first book and your formative books are not going to be bestsellers. They might not even be that good. But it's important to do it instead of kind of circling around it and kind of learning everything before you do it. For me, it's you learn while you're doing it. You write it, you're learning as you're writing it, and then you look at other sources of information. And then of course, for me specifically, when I first wrote my book, it was long descriptions of one little thing. And then I learned as I wrote that, and feedback from other people is incredibly important. I learned to shorten descriptions down and just make it more concise.